So let's talk about the power of the big and stompy Redemptor Dreadnought. What can the Primaris Dreadnought in Chief do in game? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the Redemptor Dreadnought for a unit review, talk briefly about the model and its lore, then go through its datasheet, strength and weaknesses, and what combos and things you can do with it in game. As with the rest of the Space Marine Dreadnoughts, the Redemptor is a big armoured fighting sarcophagus. They contain the interred remains of an injured battle brother, and the Redemptor itself is kind of notorious for depleting the life force of its unfortunate pilots, burning through fallen heroes of the chapter with a pretty depressing pace. Even in death they still serve. Recently one also got to get a slightly starring role in the Space Marine 2 game as well. I really did enjoy the way that was executed in that one. Nice unreasonable levels of righteous anger, and a nice path of destruction, including slinging a Helldrake straight out of the sky. The miniature kit from Games Workshop is £47.50, €62 or $79. Like a fair few Space Marine vehicles, that does feel like quite a lot for the amount of plastic that you get. It's biggish for a Dreadnought, but feels a little bit less massive than say a battle tank to me. At least compared with a fair few other Space Marine options out there, it gets you at least a fairly reasonable points cost in game. The points per dollar ratio is 2.7, which isn't awful, though that is mainly because of the rules that it has at the moment, particularly the -1 damage, meaning it commands a high points cost. In general, the miniature was pretty well received when it came out, a nice Primaris update on the classic boxy Dreadnought, looking maybe a little bit more practical and more dangerous looking while still keeping the feel. Personally, I think for the most part they did quite a good job. The kit's quite a nice flexible one as well, a fair bit of posability. I magnetised mine at the waist, and plus they get a good number of weapon options, a big Gatling cannon versus plasma cannon on the right arm, and then a few more options with the small arms. As ever, if you were looking to pick up a new Redemptor, feel free to check out the discount links in the video description below. Generally buying through discount retailers can save a good amount of money versus Games Workshop, and the specific ones in the video description help to support the channel a little bit. Say 15% off in the UK from Element Games, or 15% off from Wargame Portal in the USA. There's plenty of other good options for 40k discount stuff around though, of course. Let's jump into the all-important rules though, and go through the Redemptor's datasheet. In game it costs 210 points these days. It's been a little bit up and down throughout the course of 10th. I think the highest it was 225 and the lowest was 200. It seems that 210 points is a good enough value where it sees a fair amount of play. It's a big stompy Space Marine vehicle unit with a movement of 8 inches, which does mean that it's likely going to have to face up to some enemy damage before it gets too close or makes combat or anything. It's got OC4, which isn't huge but can contribute a little bit to holding those midfield objectives. Perhaps one of the single most standout things though about the Redemptor is the durability. It's toughness 10 with 12 wounds and a 2+ save, which is already quite nice. I'd say that on its own wouldn't be desperately outstanding for 210 points, but the 2+ save is certainly nice, as it's generally pretty easy to get cover in 10th edition, and then you can threaten to use Armour of Contempt if the opponent attacks it with some serious anti-tank stuff, and between the two it could mean that you're saving AP2 on a 2+ still, or AP3 on a 3. Beyond that though, it gets its rather nice special rule, -1 from the damage of each attack allocated to it. In particular, that's really great against damage 2 and damage 3. Damage 2 will become damage 1, so basically lose half its output. Damage 3 becomes damage 2, and again that's a third of the damage lost essentially. A little bit less effective against really big damage things like las cannons, and doesn't do anything against damage 1 or mortal wounds and things. Mortal wounds in particular can be a fairly good way to put some damage on it between the high saves and getting around that rule. In general though, it's notably sturdy, one of the Space Marine units that can be far happier to expose itself to enemy firepower than the rest. I feel like the Redemptor looks like it's kind of a mixed role unit between shooting and melee, though in reality I'd argue it's probably a little bit more impressive on the whole shooting side of things, even if it is a bit mixed role. Its melee profile is 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3. Given a few turns in combat with something, that'll certainly do a fair amount of damage, though it's not the sort of profile that, like in ages past, might have been wiping out entire battle tanks in a single round. I believe it had a big D3+3 back in 9th edition. Even if targeting a fairly optimal target like a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle, you'll only usually be averaging around about 1 or 2 failed saves, so something like 3 or 6 wounds. Definitely not awful, but it's not quite one-rounding heavy hitters. You could certainly use Tank Shock though if you needed a little bit more oomph. For its range damage output, it's got a whole bunch of secondary weapons, the choice between a Heavy Flamer and Onslaught Gatling Cannon, which basically everyone takes the Onslaught Gatling Cannon, 8 shots out to 24-inch range, strength 5 AP0 and damage 1. but it gets devastating wounds. Just in general, that's going to be more hits than the heavy flamer, and the dev wounds makes it just a bit nice that you can have a good chance of at least doing some damage to basically everything. The Storm Bolters and the Frag Storm are mounted on the sort of chest gun. They'll want to go after 1 wound infantry if they can, though neither of them is enormously standout really. I could happily go either. Maybe the Storm Bolters could get a little preference given that they can fire better in melee. And then you get an Icarus pod on the top, D3 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2. Never really going to be standout against anything, but not useless against most things, might kill the odd Space Marine or two. For the main event though, you get the option between the Macroplasma Incinerator or the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon. The Macroplasma gets you D6 plus 1 shots, strength 9, AP 4 and damage 3, all at a big 36-inch range. To use that boosted profile though, you do need to take the hazardous check. The Macroplasma is probably best at shooting against elite infantry, but given AP 4 and damage 3, it can chip in against tough stuff if you need it to. The Heavy Onslaught gets 4 more shots and strength 6 versus the regular Onslaught Gatling Cannon. In general, I feel like these are kind of badly balanced for 10th edition. That one's going to be a bit better against killing 1 wound infantry, though the Redemptor's already got a few guns that can already do that fairly well. It doesn't usually tend to be something that you're massively lacking for in Space Marine armies. As a result, I've seen far more people going for the bigger, chunkier Macroplasma. Even against, say, medium infantry like Space Marines, that's way ahead and tends to be better against things like Terminators or any tough tanks and vehicles where the damage 3 can take effect. The biggest downside is definitely that hazardous roll though. Once every 6 shots you're going to do a nasty 3 mortal wounds to your Dreadnought, and given the cost of the thing is 210 points, at least in theory land that's around about 50 points worth of damage dealt to your own machine. It definitely feels like one of the better targets for a command point reroll. If you do happen to have one going spare, wounds aren't that easy to chip off a Redemptor besides that. In any case, putting its firepower together, it's really quite general purpose. One of these with a Macroplasma and Onslaught Gatling Cannon will kill around about 8 Horde models, around about 4 Space Marines, 1 or 2 Terminators, and averages about 6 wounds to a Rhino tank or 3 or 4 to a Land Raider. That could get better with Oath of Moment and other buffs as well. For the Macroplasma, it might well be worth not overcharging against certain targets. Anything that's standard Space Marine or more Horde is probably not worth going for. And bear in mind that sometimes the order of fire between the different weapon profiles can matter a bit. Say for example, if you had some 3 wound infantry and one was alive on 1 wound, it probably makes sense to fire the damage 1 weapons first, hopefully to try and chip off that last wound, and then the big Macroplasma can go into the remaining waddles and get some complete kills as opposed to destroying an injured one. Overall though, the Redemptor Dreadnought's got a fair bit going for it. For its main strengths, I'd say great durability, particularly with the -1 damage, and certain things are going to have a really tough time killing it. Its range damage output might not be a standout in terms of the sheer amount of it, but it's nicely general purpose, and in general you've got a pretty good chance of getting more than 1 burst of fire out of it, and then being able to at least threaten the charge and do a fair bit of damage in melee as well could potentially let you double down if your opponent lets it get too close. It's just quite easy to use, stomp it up the mid board and fight for the midfield objectives, a good unit to make your opponent have to deal with while maybe some of the other things do clever things. For downsides, it is fairly high investment, 210 points is a bit much for some people. The range damage won't really compare very well against other Space Marine tanks and vehicles, given that this thing also has the advantage of good durability and a bit of melee. It does pay for those, and certain things could still be very bad news for it, anything really high AP and really high damage, like say Tyranid Tyrannofexes or enemy Gladiator Lancers, could crack its armour a little bit faster than you'd really like for the investment. Beyond its base datasheet though, there's quite a lot that can be done for it for support. As mentioned, Oath of Moment is rather nice for the big reroll. As a scary Space Marine vehicle with a lot of damage output and only hitting on a 3+ with no intrinsic buffs, it means that you'd usually get fairly full value out of that. The same is true of a bunch of Space Marine units though, I suppose. For generic stratagems, both Armour of Contempt and Tank Shock seem like some of the best. Armour of Contempt in cover in particular, as mentioned, and also bear in mind just re-rolling a single saving throw could sometimes be really big on this guy. If you already had a 3+ or 4+ save, and then the opponent gets a big damage D6 +1 or something through, that could be a lot of wounds and value of Dreadnought saved. I guess otherwise you could Overwatch or Heroic Intervene. Maybe the Overwatch could occasionally be worth it if something like a single converted Macroplasma hit and wound could have a big impact, maybe killing a model that was just about to deal some pretty nasty damage or finishing off a character. In general though, I wouldn't say it stand out above other things for this. Otherwise, in big Space Marine gunline style armies, they could make quite good use of a bunch of the range support things that Space Marines have. In particular, perhaps the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike is one of the more interesting ones. Getting a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles makes the macroplasma just incredibly general purpose. A couple of these could spell some very bad news for even big tough things like Lehman Russes or Land Raiders maybe. And there are a few other buffing units that you can use, like Incursors for the +1 to hit, or the Combi Weapon Lieutenant for some rerolls on mid-board objectives. The single most obvious thing to use with the Redemptor though is likely the Primaris Tech Marine. 55 points for a cheap and efficient little buffing character. I think at the Dreadnought stats you certainly can justify him between the +1 to hit and then the repairing those very hard wounds to take off. I feel like you might want to go the route of having at least 2 Redemptors or Redemptor and some other vehicles though if you're going to have one around, just so he's still got options if one of his charges gets popped. With its 8-inch move as well, the Redemptor Dreadnoughts may be a little bit less likely to outpace the Tech Marine as opposed to some of the vehicles if they want to go moving around fast. Interestingly enough, the Redemptor can be used in a Storm Raven as well. He gets to carry one in the grapples on its back, and then you effectively get to slingshot it 20 inches up the board turn 1. Put it down, and then you can use both the Redemptors and the Storm Raven's firepower to just absolutely alpha strike something. Maybe with a bit of Oath of Moment support. The whole strategy is far less favoured in competitive play than it used to be, mainly due to Games Workshop increasing the cost of the Storm Raven. It still could be an interesting enough option for Dark Angels maybe in particular. The done thing for them was often to have these two as a pair and then get them -1 to hit and cover with the Dark Shroud. And then you've just got 2 very, very tanky vehicles that have all of that plus -1 damage and also can use Armour of Contempt. And between that it could be quite a big problem for people. Storm Ravens are very pricey at 280 points now, and overall it's probably not quite as worth it versus just foot slogging the Redemptors. I still think it's a tactic that you could make work if you wanted to, but it's likely to be better against certain armies than others. Otherwise, for unit support we've got Detachments, and the Redemptor Dreadnought is one of the staple units of the Ironstorm Spearhead that does have plenty of competition from the other Space Marine armour. It's definitely not uncommon to see them in multiples here though. The core rule allows you to reroll a single dice whenever you attack, and that's really good both for the macroplasma and the punchy melee that it has. And as a big costly unit, it can be quite good for multiple different stratagems. The auto-explode for D3 mortal wounds could be handy. It is a bit likely to be playing aggressive more so than some vehicles. There's the big Walker one for a +1 to hit and a bunch of other stuff. Return fire when it's reduced to below half strength. In general, it's going to have a pretty good chance of having that happen and not just immediately dying with that -1 damage. And then basically any of the Tech Marine buffs that can be put on vehicles nearby are good, maybe in particular that cancel damage one. There you could use the big combo with lethal and sustained hits on a 5+, though that does cost 2 command points and an enhancement now. Otherwise for the Space Marine detachments, between a good amount of shooting and melee, all the rest are going to at least do something for it. I'd say for being standout, it's probably the Gladius that's the other strong one. The combos of advance and shoot or advance and charge, or the fallback options, I think are all really quite handy for it, being kind of slow but having a fair bit of threat. And I guess occasionally it could make use of things like Honour the Chapter or Storm of Fire if you wanted to, though I feel like that's a bit more niche situation as opposed to something that you go out to do. Otherwise between them, the Firestorm could get a little bit mobility and firepower with the Assault keyword, and the +1 strength can be quite nice for a few things breakpoints. Getting that macroplasma to strength 10 on occasion could be really big. The Vanguard Spearhead mainly does infantry things, so it isn't going to be so emphasised. It does get kind of ridiculously tanky in this detachment though, with both cover and stealth at greater than 12 inches. A lot of gun lines are going to struggle with that kind of durability. And otherwise I guess the first company could make some good use out of the reroll wounds thing that they get once per game. I guess that's good for the vast majority of Space Marine units, but anything with devastating wounds like the Gatling cannons could enjoy the big oath turn I suppose. In Stormlights you could advance and charge, but giving up shooting isn't ideal. An Anvil Siege Force could have use that still, and get a +1 to hit, though for the most part the Redemptor is going to need to move each turn, gaining lines of sight or pushing on the midfield objectives and things. They do have a few damage dealer stratagems, but at the 2 command points they are rather pricey. Finally looking at chapters, they don't really tend to have the biggest impact on most vehicles. For the core codex there's a couple of relevant ones. Gilliman could give them some free stratagems as an unusual target for things to be able to do that. I feel like particularly at his 285 points, it's looking a bit more interesting for Ironstorm Spearhead now. Getting things like the discounted version of the Mercier's weakness and then also threatening to Oath of Moment something in your own turn are both quite good. And for the Iron Hands themselves, Ironfather Phyros pairs fairly well with them, lightly stomping up the board, giving them big healing and Tech Marine style buffs, maybe alongside a durable bodyguard of heavy intercessors. Beyond that, the Blood Angels can have them hit extra savage on the charge with +1 attack and strength 14. Nice enough stuff there. The Black Templars and the Space Wolves can both get them 6+ feel no pains, and potentially a bit more AP and melee occasionally could help out. And the Dark Angels maybe don't tend to use their codex detachments in more optimised play quite so much. I guess they could go for that Dark Shroud and Storm Raven strategy if they wanted to though. In terms of optimised lists and getting put on the table in anger, Space Marines as always have really quite a lot of competition, and after a whole load of balance passes, the vast majority of the codex isn't now at least somewhat usable, though most things don't enormously stand out for the crowd either. Redemptor Dreadnought still seems to be getting played in competitive lists though. I had a quick review of 10 of the higher placing Space Marine lists in Pariah Nexus, and Redemptors were used in 3 of those, 2 Ironstorm Spearheads and 1 Gladius Task Force. In general, I feel like there are hard units to ever say that that's a completely wrong choice. Just a bit of a pressure model to have stomping up the board and forcing the opponent to deal with its good durability. Otherwise it is just going to deal some pretty nasty damage to something important turn on turn, and potentially more so if it gets both shooting then a charge off. For rivals though, for big armoured things, it's got an awful lot of competition. For Ironstorm Spearhead, I guess to be things like Vindicators, Gladiator Lancers, the Repulsor Executioner, maybe the Ballista's Dreadnought, now it's at 130 points. Obviously all of those do different things, and none of them do melee as well. They all generally tend to be a bit better at destroying enemy tanks and vehicles than the Redemptor, though for the most part aren't as tough per point, besides the Ballistas, which is incredibly durable for the cost. Otherwise, for more general lists, it might be competing against things like damage combos in Land Raiders or Repulsors, maybe things like Fire Discipline combos getting out of there, or aggressors with characters. I think maybe for the aggressive Dreadnought style role, I still probably rate the Redemptor as the stronger of the two. Not by a whole load though, and it's certainly far stronger than the Firstborn Dreadnought, which Games Workshop seem to have entirely abandoned for balance pass purposes. Overall, for using it in-game, I say the Redemptor is a sort of usable to strong Space Marine unit, maybe a little bit ahead of the power curve compared with the majority of the codex. I'd go with the armament of the Macroplasma, Onslaught Gatling Cannon and Storm Bolters, and if you're running multiple, could certainly consider running with a Tech Marine, particularly an Ironstorm Spearhead with those good enhancements. My typical battle plan would be to have it move up the board and make the opponents deal with it, ideally trying to make sure that some part of its chassis toes into cover each turn so you can get that on its 2+ save if the opponent does have guns to threaten it. Ideally the Macroplasma would very much like to be hunting down enemy heavy infantry. The rest of the guns can chip in opportunistically, maybe a bit more suited to taking down hordes, and then when it makes sense it can hopefully try and both shoot and then charge. Again, probably best placed against either medium vehicles or elite infantry of some sort if it gets the choice. In any case though, let me know what you think of the big Dreadnought itself. How have Redemptors been faring on the tabletop for you? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day, and I'm sure there'll be more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.